The comment landed wrong immediately, not because it was loud or aggressive, but because it arrived at exactly the moment when nobody was supposed to be joking, cutting straight through the quiet concentration the Americans had built around themselves while preparing for the mission. The SEAL team leader mid-sentence and walking everyone through timing and movement. When one of the Australians, leaning back with his notebook resting loosely on his knee, glanced down at the map and said almost offhandedly that if it all went pear-shaped, at least it would be quick. The pause that followed was short but unmistakable. The kind that happens when a room collectively checks itself to make sure it heard something correctly. A couple of SEALs exchanging looks, while nobody laughed or smiled. The comment not aimed at anyone in particular, and somehow worse for that, because it felt casual in a moment where casual didn't belong. Dismissive even, as if the gravity of what they were about to do hadn't fully registered with the Australians. And in the SEALs' world, this was exactly the point where tone mattered, where seriousness itself was a form of respect, and humor, if it existed at all, stayed buried until the job was finished. The Australian didn't clarify or apologize, didn't soften the remark or explain it away. He simply took a sip of coffee and kept listening. And although the briefing continued smoothly enough on the surface, something had already shifted underneath it. The SEALs remaining focused and professional as always, but now carrying a quiet edge that hadn't been there before. Not about doctrine or tactics yet, but about attitude. About whether the people they were about to rely on treated the mission with the same weight they did. As the planning session went on, the disconnect only became more pronounced from the American perspective, because while the Australians didn't interrupt and listened carefully, when they did speak, it was never framed the way the SEALs expected. Precise language and formal acknowledgement on one side, met with understatement on the other. Contingencies and worst-case scenarios met with nods and remarks like they'd see how it behaved, or if it got noisy, they'd adjust. A word that surfaced more than once and rubbed the Americans the wrong way every time, because adjust sounded vague, improvised, like something you said when you hadn't thought things through all the way. Whereas to the SEALs adjustment was something that happened within a framework, not something you treated as a plan in itself. There was also the matter of rank, which stood out the longer the conversation went on, because an Australian officer who was clearly senior listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his tone never changed, whether he was addressing another officer or an enlisted man. No visible deference, no formal structure to how comments were directed, and when a junior Australian described a route as a bit unpleasant, the officer replied that it was one way to put it without correcting him or reasserting authority, a dynamic that read to the SEALs as loose, maybe even disrespectful. They were used to professionalism being visible and audible, something you could hear in the way people spoke and see in the way they carried themselves. Respect shown through bearing and seriousness, through not making light of things that could go badly wrong very quickly, while the Australians seemed to treat respect as something implicit rather than something you performed. By the time the briefing wrapped up, the SEALs were uneasy in a way they hadn't expected to be, trusting Australian competence in a general sense, because everyone had heard the reputation, but also knowing reputation did not always survive contact with reality, and right now, reality felt uncomfortably casual. One of the Americans putting it quietly while they checked their gear, that he couldn't tell if the Australians were relaxed or if they just didn't care. The mission itself began without ceremony, pushing out from the forward position into terrain that demanded attention immediately, dense vegetation and broken sightlines over ground that punished careless movement, the SEALs slipping naturally into their rhythm, scanning, spacing, moving with the deliberate precision drilled into muscle memory, while the Australians moved with them, but not in the same way. Not rushing, not snapping into obvious formations. Moving as if time wasn't pressing them, even though everyone knew it was, and occasionally making remarks that felt wildly out of place in context. "Bit warm today," someone murmured during a halt under cover, and later, when movement ahead forced a longer pause than expected. Another Australian commented that it could be worse, and at least it wasn't raining. The words delivered without tension or edge, just observation, and what unsettled the SEALs was that none of this translated into sloppiness. Spacing, staying tight. Noise, discipline impeccable. Movement controlled. While the tone never changed, even as the environment grew less forgiving and the stakes quietly rose. What bothered the SEALs most was that the Australians didn't seem to be performing seriousness. They weren't stiffening as pressure increased, or tightening language and posture the way Americans instinctively did. And if anything, they appeared calmer as the situation developed. A calm that felt wrong to a mindset shaped by training where intensity rose alongside risk. The first real test came when things slid from inconvenient into genuinely bad. Movement in the distance becoming movement closer than expected, and then into the unmistakable sense that the situation was narrowing. The jungle closing in, not physically, but tactically, as lines of movement overlapped and time windows shrank. This being the point where tension usually showed itself clearly. Voices sharpening and commands growing clipped. The SEALs feeling that internal tightening immediately. The recognition that decisions with consequences were coming. The Australians felt it too, but they didn't show it. And instead of barking orders or shifting tone, the senior Australian gave a few short instructions delivered conversationally but precise in content. No raised voice, no visible change in demeanor, just calm redirection as positions adjusted. Fields of observation shifted, and the patrol reoriented smoothly without anyone needing to announce that something had changed. One of the SEALs registered the disconnect almost in real time, realizing that the Australians were acting decisively, without acting intense. The seriousness present, but not advertised. And then came the moment where everything could have tipped, as the situation deteriorated faster than expected. Not catastrophic, but bad enough that mistakes would compound quickly. No longer theoretical planning, but the kind of scenario where clarity mattered more than confidence, and panic, if it appeared, would spread. It was here that the Australians did something that finally forced the SEALs to stop interpreting tone as meaning, because in the middle of that tightening situation with options narrowing and time compressing, one of them remarked quietly, almost conversationally, that this wasn't ideal, and the SEAL nearest him almost snapped back, because nothing about it was ideal, and stating the obvious felt dangerously close to flippancy. Until the Australian followed the remark immediately with clear, calm direction, laying out exactly what needed to happen next. Who would move, who would hold, and how they would manage the problem without escalating it further. No hesitation, no uncertainty, no wasted movement. The decision-making was clean, and suddenly the SEALs realized something unsettling. That the humor hadn't been covering uncertainty, or masking fear, or signaling disrespect for the situation. It had been control. Because the Australians weren't using humor, because they didn't take the mission seriously, but because they did. Because staying emotionally level under pressure allowed them to think clearly when things went wrong, which they always did eventually. And by the time the immediate danger passed, the SEALs were still processing it, noting that the Australians hadn't raised their voices, invoked rank, or shifted into a different mode. They had simply done what needed to be done, calmly and efficiently, without performing seriousness for anyone's benefit. And that forced the SEALs to confront an uncomfortable truth, that they had mistaken formality for discipline and tone for intent. By the time they moved again, the atmosphere inside the patrol had shifted in a way that would have been hard to describe to anyone who wasn't there, because nothing outwardly dramatic had happened. Yet the Americans were no longer evaluating the Australians in the same way, even if they hadn't fully admitted it to themselves yet. The irritation had softened, replaced by something closer to watchfulness, a quieter form of attention, where tone was no longer taken at face value. At one point, movement ahead forced another extended halt, longer than the Americans would normally tolerate, without repositioning. The SEALs felt the familiar itch return, the sense that staying still too long invited trouble, that control came from action rather than restraint. One of them glanced toward the Australian nearest him, expecting at least a sign of tension, some acknowledgement that the situation was becoming uncomfortable. Instead, the Australian quietly shifted his weight, adjusted his grip, and murmured, "Might take a bit," as if waiting were an inconvenience rather than a threat. What mattered wasn't the comment itself, but what followed it. No one fidgeted. No one rushed. Spacing held. Observation continued uninterrupted. The Australians were clearly aware of the risk, but they weren't amplifying it emotionally, and that restraint seemed to bleed into the rest of the patrol. The SEALs found themselves slowing their own internal tempo, not because they had been told to, but because reacting aggressively no longer felt necessary. When movement finally resumed, it did so on the Australians' timing, not because the situation had become safe, but because the window they were waiting for had opened. The transition was smooth, almost invisible, and the SEALs realized afterward that they hadn't felt the usual spike of relief that came with moving again. The calm had carried through the pause rather than being released by action. As the mission continued, the SEALs began to notice something else that challenged their initial interpretation. When the Australians did encounter moments that truly mattered, moments where error would have immediate consequences, the humor vanished instantly, replaced not by stiffness or formality, but by absolute clarity. Commands became shorter, movements sharper, and coordination tighter, all without any need to announce that the situation had escalated. That contrast was important. The Australians were not informal all the time. They were selectively informal, and the shift between modes was instantaneous when required. This wasn't disrespect for authority or danger. It was a deliberate separation between emotional tone and operational seriousness. For the SEALs, this separation was new. Their own training often linked intensity of tone with intensity of situation. And while that worked well in many contexts, it also carried the risk of narrowing perception under stress. What they were seeing now suggested an alternative, one where calm was preserved as long as possible so that clarity could be deployed when it actually mattered. The mission progressed, and with it, the Americans' internal narrative began to change. The Australian sarcasm no longer felt dismissive. Their understatement no longer felt careless. It began to read as confidence, not arrogance, but confidence born of having been in enough bad situations to know that panic rarely improved them. This didn't mean the SEALs adopted the Australian style wholesale, or that they suddenly preferred it, but the assumption that informality equaled disrespect was quietly dismantled, piece by piece, replaced by a more nuanced understanding that professionalism did not always wear the same uniform. By the end of that phase of the mission, the SEALs were no longer watching the Australians for signs of failure or lack of seriousness. They were watching them to understand how they stayed so level when things went wrong, how they could joke lightly one moment and execute precisely the next without the transition ever feeling forced. The most unsettling realization came late, when one of the Americans admitted to himself that he felt calmer operating alongside the Australians than he would have expected, not because the situation was safer, but because decisions were being made without unnecessary emotional noise. The calm was not performative. It was functional. Whatever doubts had existed at the start were no longer about competence or commitment. They were about style, and style, the SEALs were beginning to understand, was not the same thing as substance. The mission wasn't finished yet, and the worst conditions were still ahead. But the framework through which the Americans were interpreting the Australians had fundamentally shifted. What had once felt like disrespect now looked like a different way of carrying responsibility. At one point, as the patrol halted in a position that offered limited concealment and even fewer options for quick movement, one of the Australians assessed the situation and said, in the same steady tone he had used all day, "All right, we'll hold here for a bit and see what it wants to do." As if the environment itself were a problem to be observed, rather than an enemy to be confronted. That phrasing stuck with the SEALs, because it framed the situation in a way they hadn't been trained to think about, not as a crisis demanding immediate resolution, but as a condition that could be allowed to reveal its own shape if handled patiently enough. There was no bravado in it, no attempt to downplay risk, just an implicit confidence that clarity would emerge if they didn't rush to manufacture it. Moments later, movement nearby confirmed that assessment. Not a sudden rush or coordinated sweep, but cautious probing, the kind that suggested uncertainty on the other side as well. And the Australians responded by doing almost nothing at all, holding position, reducing profile, trusting that the absence of reaction was itself a form of control. The Americans felt the strain acutely then, because everything in their instincts pushed them toward action, toward doing something to regain initiative. Yet every example they had witnessed so far suggested that action, in this case, would be the thing that tipped the balance against them. They stayed still, muscles tight, attention absolute, watching the Australians not for reassurance, but for cues about when restraint would stop being viable. What followed was a stretch of time that felt longer than it probably was. Seconds expanding under pressure, sound magnified, breath measured carefully. And in that span, the Americans began to understand the Australians' humor in a new way, not as levity, but as a mechanism that kept their minds from locking up when conditions were at their worst. The jokes had stopped now, but the calm that produced them remained, and that calm was contagious in a way tension never was. When the Australians finally shifted, it wasn't abrupt, and it wasn't dramatic. Just a smooth, deliberate repositioning that took advantage of a subtle change in the environment, a lull, a redirection of movement elsewhere, something they had clearly been waiting for. The Americans moved with them, realizing afterward that they hadn't felt rushed or panicked during the adjustment, a rare sensation in situations like this. Only once they had cleared the immediate danger did one of the Americans fully register what had happened, that at no point had the Australians lost control of the situation, even when it was at its worst, and that their casual tone earlier in the day hadn't been a lack of seriousness, but the product of confidence, built on repeated exposure to exactly this kind of pressure. The irony wasn't lost on them. What had initially felt disrespectful had turned out to be one of the most disciplined behaviors they had witnessed, not because it looked disciplined, but because it functioned that way when the environment was actively working against them. And that realization set the stage for the final outcome of the mission, where trust would no longer be theoretical, and the Australians' calm would prove its value beyond interpretation. As they paused briefly to let the environment settle before crossing a narrow break in the terrain, one of the Australians glanced back toward the Americans and made a quiet comment about getting a brew on once they were clear, delivered with the same dry tone he might have used back at base. And this time, there was no irritation, no internal recoil from the Americans, just an understanding that the comment wasn't minimizing what had happened, but acknowledging that it had passed without allowing it to linger unnecessarily. The Americans realized then that they had been reading the Australians backward at the start, mistaking restraint for irreverence and humor for indifference, when in reality, both were tools, ways of managing the psychological load of operating in environments where tension could easily become the enemy long before any opposing force ever did. The Australians weren't casual about risk. They were disciplined about emotion, and that discipline had proven its value when the margin was thinnest. As they reached the final rally point and began the quiet routine of accounting for one another, checking gear, confirming everyone was intact, the contrast between styles no longer felt like a problem to be solved or a difference to be judged. It felt like a lesson that had arrived without being taught, one that had made itself unavoidable through outcome rather than argument. Later, back in relative safety, as weapons were cleared and packs were set down, the Americans found themselves replaying moments from the mission, not the obvious ones, but the quieter decisions that had prevented those moments from becoming catastrophic. They remembered how quickly the Australians had shifted from understatement to absolute clarity when it mattered, how hierarchy had snapped into place instantly without needing to be announced, how no one had questioned authority because authority had been exercised competently rather than theatrically. One of the Americans remarked, almost to himself, that he'd never seen anyone manage pressure by refusing to acknowledge it out loud, and one of the Australians overheard and smiled faintly, not correcting him, not explaining, just accepting the observation as something the American had earned through experience rather than conversation. What stayed with the Americans most wasn't a specific tactic or phrase, but the realization that respect didn't always look the way they expected it to look, and that professionalism didn't always announce itself through formality or intensity. Sometimes it showed up as the ability to keep one's emotional bandwidth intact when everything around you was trying to consume it. In the days that followed, As the mission was discussed in fragments and lessons were quietly absorbed rather than formally recorded, the Americans noticed a shift in themselves. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. They found their own tone adjusting under pressure, their own responses becoming more measured, not because they were copying the Australians, but because they had seen firsthand what that composure enabled when things went wrong. There was no formal acknowledgement of this change, no declaration that one way was better than the other, because the truth was more nuanced than that. The Americans' approach had its own strengths, its own contexts where intensity and structure mattered deeply. What the Australians had offered wasn't a replacement, but an expansion, a reminder that emotional control could be as decisive as physical action, and that humor, used correctly, wasn't a sign of disrespect, but of confidence earned through repetition. The Australians, for their part, returned to their routines without ceremony, treating the mission as one more example of a pattern they already understood. They didn't seek validation or recognition, and they didn't adjust their behavior to be more palatable to American expectations. They simply kept doing what they had always done, trusting that outcomes would speak louder than tone. For the Americans, that trust was now justified. What had started as irritation had turned into respect, not because the Australians had changed, but because the Americans had learned to read them correctly, understanding that the absence of visible tension didn't mean the absence of seriousness, and that calm under pressure wasn't accidental, but cultivated. By the time the SEALs moved on to their next operation, the experience lingered, not as a story they told loudly, but as a quiet recalibration of how they interpreted behavior in joint environments, how they distinguished style from substance, and how they measured professionalism when it mattered most. They no longer equated seriousness with silence or authority with volume, and they no longer mistook humor for indifference. They had seen how quickly the Australians could snap into precision when required, and how that precision was enabled, not hindered, by a culture that refused to let pressure dictate emotion. In the end, the Australians hadn't shocked the Americans by being disrespectful, or even by being different. They had shocked them by demonstrating that composure, once internalized deeply enough, didn't need to be signaled at all, because when things went wrong, it revealed itself naturally, cleanly, and without hesitation. And that understanding stayed with the SEALs long after the mission ended, shaping how they worked with others, how they led under stress, and how they judged competence in environments where appearances were unreliable and outcomes were the only honest measure of respect. Subscribe if you liked the video. I put a lot of effort to bring you lesser-known stories of the past. Do let me know if you have any feedback or suggestions.